Okay, let's unpack this. Rare earth elements, REEs, they're just so critical, right, for all the tech we use. Phones, EVs, wind turbines.
Absolutely. And the demand is just, well, it's surging.
It really is, which means the hunt for new sources is seriously on.
It is, yeah. We have to look everywhere, consider every potential resource. Finding reliable supplies is a major global challenge now.
And one place getting a lot of buzz is these iron oxide apatite deposits, IOAs. You find them globally, and, well, some recent finds, like that huge one reported in Kiruna, Sweden.
Oh, yeah. Kiruna really put them on the map for REs.
It highlights the potential, doesn't it?
Definitely. I mean, IOAs, they've always been known for iron, mined for it for ages, but this RE potential is a relatively new focus, and it's significant.
Right, but the tricky thing is, even though we know they can have lots of REs, exactly how they form and how they get so enriched, well, that's still kind of debated, isn't it?
It is. There are several ideas out there, and pinning down the exact mechanisms is, well, it's ongoing work for geoscientists.
And understanding that is key, right? Not just academic curiosity, but it helps us actually find more of these deposits.
Precisely. If you know the recipe, you know where to look for the ingredients.
So one idea that's been around involves something called immiscibility. You mentioned it's like oil and water separating.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Imagine deep underground you have this molten rock, magma, and within that you can get this separation, this unmixing,
Okay.
where an iron oxide and phosphate-rich liquid, let's call it the FeFP liquid, separates out from the main silica-rich magma, the Sci liquid.
Like a blob of iron phosphate stuff forming within the rest of the magma.
Essentially, yes. And that separation is one proposed way you form these distinct iron-rich bodies, the IOAs.
But figuring out where the trace elements go during that split, especially the REs, that's been tough.
It has experimentally. It's hard to replicate and, crucially, hard to analyze those tiny amounts in experiments.
Which brings us to why we're doing this deep dive. We've got this new study, Jan and colleagues, 2024. And they use some clever lab tricks, right, to look at this FeP size separation and how the REs behave.
Exactly. This study trying to tackle that experimental problem directly. You see, earlier attempts often resulted in these microscopic droplets of the separated liquids.
Too small to measure properly.
Way too small to reliably analyze for trace elements like REEs with, standard lab equipment.
Okay, so how did Jan's team get around that? What was their clever trick?
They used what they call a novel piston cylinder layered experimental design. So they've got this high pressure, high temperature rig.
Okay, like a mini earth crust simulator.
Pretty much. But instead of just mixing all the starting stuff, synthetic rock powder, iron phosphate, apatite together, they layered it carefully inside the experimental capsule.
Huh. Like making a tiny geological layer cake.
Chuckle slightly.
Yeah.
That's actually a pretty good way to put it, yeah.
And the conditions.
Yeah.
Hot, high pressure.
Oh, yeah. Temperatures between 800 and 1150 Celsius. Pressures up to zero 0.8 gigapascals.
Wow, that's, what, 8,000 times atmospheric pressure?
Roughly, yes. Serious pressure. They also added water, but as solid hydroxides, and importantly, controlled the oxygen levels.
Oxygen fugacity.
Yeah.
That's like controlling the redox state, how much oxygen is available to react.
Exactly. They kept it near conditions where minerals like magnetite and hematite form naturally.
And the layering. That was the key to getting bigger blobs of separated liquid.
It seems so. It encouraged the FeP and Sci liquids, once they unmixed, to pool into larger, more distinct areas within the capsule. Made them much easier to hit with analytical probes later.
Makes sense. So they run the experiment, then quench it, cool it fast.
Right. Quench it to freeze everything in place, preserving the state of the molten liquids.
And then how do they figure out what was what chemically?
Standard geological toolkit, really. They used an electron probe microanalyzer EPMA for the major elements that zaps the sample with electrons.
Okay, and for the trace elements, the REEs?
For those, they used laser ablation ICP-MS. So you blast a tiny spot with a laser
Vaporize it.
and feed that vapor into a mass spectrometer to measure the tiny amounts of trace elements very precisely.
And they checked multiple spots
Uh,
to make sure it was consistent.
yes, exactly. Checking multiple spots within each liquid phase helps ensure the results are reliable, that the liquids were, chemically homogeneous, close to equilibrium.
Okay, so the experiments worked. They got the liquids to separate and could measure them. But did it look like the real thing? Did the textures match what geologists see in actual IOA rocks?
And this is where it gets really convincing. The answer is yes. The textures they created in the lab were remarkably similar to microscopic features seen in natural IOA deposits.
That's huge. That really suggests they're onto the right process. What kind of textures?
Well, for one, they often saw tiny droplets of the silicate liquid trapped inside the iron phosphate liquid areas.
Oh,
And that perfectly matches observations of silicate melt inclusions found inside magnetite crystals in real deposits, like the famous El Laco deposit in Chile.
so bits of the other liquid got trapped as the iron stuff solidified.
Seems like it. And another thing, the separation wasn't always perfect, you know? Sometimes larger blobs of silicate liquid seem to get swept along within the FeP melt.
Right.
And that could explain why you sometimes find silicate minerals like actinolite, pyroxene, even quartz mixed into IOA ores. Even in parts that should be mostly iron and phosphate, they're really Re-rich zones.
Like those per Geiger ores they talk about at Kiruna.
Exactly like those. It explains why they aren't always pure.
Any other textural matches?
Yes, a really striking one. In the quenched experiments, the magnetite often formed these skeletal or dendritic, like tree branch shapes.
Okay.
And those shapes are almost identical to magnetite textures seen in samples from El Laco and Kiruna. It suggests that in nature, these FeP melts sometimes cooled really, really quickly, maybe even erupted.
Wow, that paints a dynamic picture. A fast-cooling, iron-rich magma.
It does. And one more thing, they also saw evidence of bubbles, sometimes attached to iron oxide grains.
Bubbles. Like gas.
Uh-huh. In geology, that often points towards hydrothermal fluid saturation, basically water coming out of the melt as a separate fluid phase at high temperature and pressure.
And hydrothermal fluids have been proposed as part of the IOA story too, right?
They have. So seeing textures linked to that in these immiscibility experiments suggests these processes might be linked or happen together.
So the textures match, the temperatures used in the lab overlap with estimates from natural rocks.
Right, the experimental temps, 800 1150C, fit smack bang in the middle of the 700 1145C range, estimated from melt inclusions in natural IOAs. It all lines up very nicely.
It really feels like they captured the essence of the natural process in the lab.
The authors certainly argue that, yes. And they also stress that this immiscibility mechanism isn't necessarily exclusive of other ideas. It could work alongside or be influenced by, say, those hydrothermal fluids we mentioned, or maybe bubble flotation helping the separation.
Okay, so let's dig into the chemistry now, the partitioning. When these FeP and Sci liquids separated, where did the different elements prefer to go?
Right. We use that partition coefficient, DL-FeP-LC. It's just the concentration in the FeP liquid divided by the concentration in the Sci liquid. Greater than 1 means it likes the FeP side.
Got it. So for the major elements.
They found fluorine, magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus F, MgO, CaO, P2O5, all had coefficients well above 1. They strongly partitioned into FeP liquid.
Which makes sense given the minerals in IOAs, right? Like fluorapatite needs F and P, and you get magnesium and calcium and pyroxenes or amphibols sometimes found there.
Precisely. It matches the known mineralogy very well.
What about trace elements, besides the REEs for now?
Things like thorium, cobalt, vanadium teak, Co-V also showed values greater than 1. They preferred the FeP liquid too.
And again, those are elements known to be enriched in many IOAs.
That's right. It fits the pattern observed in natural deposits.
Anything surprising or particularly neat in those results?
Well, the titanium story was quite interesting. They found that TiO2, titanium oxide, did partition into the FeP liquid. Its coefficient was greater than 1.
Okay, so T likes the iron melt.
But, and this is the clever part, the ratio of titanium to iron partitioning, DL-FeF-AlC-Fe, was less than 1.
Hang on. How does that work? Ti goes in, but the TIF ratio goes down.
It means that although the FeP liquid soaked up some T, it soaked up proportionally much more Fe compared to the silicate liquid it separated from. So relative to iron, the FeP liquid actually became diluted in titanium.
Ah, I see. And that explains.
It perfectly explains a classic feature of IOA magnetite. It's typically very low in titanium compared to magnetite from other types of magmatic deposits. This immiscibility process naturally produces low-Ti magnetite.
That's a really specific fingerprint explained right there. Okay, the main event, the rare earths. How did they split between the FeP and Sci liquids?
This is really the headline finding. The REEs partitioned very strongly into the FeP liquid.
Strongly? Like how strongly?
Well, first they notice it depends on how separated the liquids are, what they call the width of the immiscibility gap. Wider gap means more separation.
Which might happen as the magma cools or changes composition.
Exactly. And as that gap widened, the REEs partitioned even more strongly into the FeP melt.
Okay, give us the numbers. How strong?
For those wide immiscibility gaps, the partition coefficients, the D values, for both light and heavy REEs could get above 100.
Wow. Over 100 times more concentrated in the iron phosphate liquid compared to the silicate liquid.
Yes, that is a huge enrichment factor, achieved just by this physical separation process.
That's much higher than some older studies suggested, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Some earlier work maybe found values around, say, 10 or so for some REs. This study suggests the potential for concentration via this route is actually much, much greater than we perhaps appreciated.
And was there a difference between the lights and the heavies, LREs versus HREs?
Yes, and this is absolutely crucial. Consistently across all their experiments, the partition coefficients for the light REs were higher than for the heavy REs.
So the FeP liquid really grabs the REs, and it prefers the lights.
That's the key takeaway. It strongly prefers the LREs.
And boom, that explains it, doesn't it? That explains why natural IOA deposits are almost universally enriched in light rare earth elements.
It provides really strong experimental backing for exactly that, yes. FeP-Pi immiscibility looks like a primary control on concentrating LREs in these systems.
So when the REs are in that FeP liquid, where do they end up in the final rock? Are they just hanging out in the magnetite?
The evidence points towards them being hosted mainly in phosphate minerals that crystallize from that FeP liquid. Minerals like apatite, monazite, xenotime.
Not really in the magnetite itself.
Not primarily, no. Which makes sense chemically and also fits with the FeP liquid being enriched in phosphorus, the P2O5, needed to make those phosphate minerals.
Right, and it connects to what you see in the big picture, doesn't it? Deposits with lots of iron, maybe representing more of this evolved Fe liquid.
Yeah.
They often have more phosphate minerals.
Exactly. And those deposits, like P Ridge in the U.S. or parts of Kiruna, those tend to be the ones with the highest RE grades. High phosphate often correlates with high REs in IOAs.
So this model ties the iron, the phosphate, and the REE enrichment together very neatly. How does it fit with other ideas then? You mentioned hydrothermal fluids, bubble flotation.
Yeah, the authors are clear. They see this immiscibility as a controlling factor, especially for the REEs, but not necessarily the only game in town. It's likely compatible with other processes.
So maybe immiscibility happens, and then hydrothermal fluids interact with that FeP melt, or bubbles help it separate faster.
Something like that. Nature's usually complex, right? Multiple processes can operate together or influence each other. They even suggest things like assimilating certain rocks, like sulfate evaporates, could potentially widen that immiscibility gap, which would actually boost the REE partitioning into the FeP liquid even further, according to their findings.
So it's a framework, but other things can plug into it.
I think that's a good way to look at it.
Okay, so bringing it all together, what's the big takeaway message here, especially for someone, say, exploring for new RE deposits?
The really practical point is, if you find an iron phosphate-rich rock body and you see textures or mineralogy that suggest it formed from this kind of magmatic, facey liquid separation, that should be a prime target for RDE exploration.
Look for the signs of immiscibility.
Yes, and particularly focus on parts of that system that have high phosphate content, because that's likely where the RE is concentrated.
It gives explorers a clearer geological signature to hunt for.
It does, and it helps distinguish these IOAs from other deposits that might involve facei immiscibility, like maybe some iron-titanium deposits called nelsonites. The evidence suggests IOAs experience this specific facei type of immiscibility perhaps more intensely, leading to that much higher REE concentration.
Got it. So these incredibly detailed lab experiments mimicking deep earth processes, they really provide powerful evidence. This splitting of molten iron phosphate from silicate magma seems like a fundamental way nature concentrates REEs, especially those valuable light RE, into the IOA deposits we're now looking to as crucial resources.
It's a fundamental enrichment mechanism clearly demonstrated.
And it really underscores how understanding these deep geological processes, replicated carefully in a lab, is so vital for finding the materials we need for everything from our phones to our energy future. Because you think, what other geological secrets, what other concentration mechanisms are still waiting out there for us to uncover with this kind of careful, insightful science?